In the heart of a scorched desert, a mute boy rides a shadowless horse through a sandstorm toward the wreckage of a plane that vanished with his family. No one believes the horse exists, but it knows the truth, and it has returned to unlock memories the world buried in silence. Subscribe now to witness haunting, healing stories told like never before. Under a sky so still it felt suffocating, the desert town of Dust Creek lay submerged in a pool of silver light. Moonlight touched every dry fence post and cracked rooftop like frozen breath. The silence was heavy, not peaceful, but haunted. Nothing moved, nothing dared. Asher stood behind the old stone wall behind his grandparents' house, a lone silhouette, smaller than the shadows around him. 9 years old. Silent. His hands clenched the rough edges of the wall, his face pale against the moonlit dust. His dark hair hung in unruly strands above wide eyes that blinked but never looked away from the open stretch of desert beyond. He hadn't said a word since the accident. That stretch of sand and scrub beyond Dust Creek's edge, dead land, they called it. It was where things went missing, never came back. Where time warped under heat and memory drifted like dust in the wind. The grown-ups never talked about it, but they never went near it either. Behind him, in the back room of the crumbling adobe house, a suitcase sat under the bed. Dented, sun-faded, its latch rusted shut with time and neglect. No one had touched it since the day Asher arrived. Not Jacob, not Eliza. They left it there like a shrine to all that had gone unsaid. That suitcase held the last fragments of the life Asher had before the accident. His father's scarf, his mother's sun hat, a picture torn down the middle, pieces of a family reduced to objects. He had unpacked none of it. Neither had his soul. Inside the house, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, staring at an untouched cup of coffee. His hands, thick and calloused, were clenched tighter than necessary around the ceramic. The man had built houses with those hands once. Now, they only held silence. His gaze didn't move from the dark window in front of him. "He's not sleeping," Eliza said softly, from behind him. Her voice was barely more than a breath, yet it echoed in the space like a bell in a crypt. Jacob didn't answer. "He's been out there since sunset." Still nothing. Eliza stepped to the window and drew aside the curtain, watching the slight form of her grandson under the moon. She wore her grief differently than Jacob. She carried it like wind carries sand, slow, relentless, clinging to the edges of everything. Her eyes stayed on the boy, but her voice dropped. "You could talk to him, you know. He won't talk back. He might not need to. Maybe he just needs to hear you still know how." Jacob finally turned his head. His face, weathered like the landscape outside, was not cruel. Just hard, like something that had been sharpened too many times. "Eliza, the boy's not broken. He's just gone quiet inside. Can't fix that with a damn bedtime story." A long pause. She sighed, returning her gaze to the desert. "You're wrong," she said. "You don't fix it, you follow it." Outside, Asher didn't hear them. Or maybe he did, but the words fell flat against the humming in his chest. There was always a hum now, just under the skin, like his heart wasn't sure which beat to follow anymore. The wind tasted like copper tonight, dry, sharp. The desert shimmered in the distance, nothing but a sea of pale. But Asher's eyes caught something else, a shift, a presence. There, near the ridgeline where the land dipped low like the hollow of a broken rib, something moved, a shape. He blinked. Once, twice. It was still there. A horse. No, not just a horse. A gray horse, tall and still, standing on the crest of the sand, completely motionless. Its mane rippled slightly in the wind, but the body did not sway. No stamping hooves, no twitching ears. Just watching. What struck Asher first wasn't the silence, but the light. The horse cast no shadow. Under the full moon, with every rock and cactus carving out inky shapes across the earth, this animal had no darkness beneath it. Asher's lips parted slightly. Not a sound came, but his breath shook in the cold. He stepped forward, slowly, unsure if it was real. The horse didn't move. It was like it had been painted into the horizon, only visible to those who dared not blink. Something inside Asher stirred a memory, maybe, or a question. He took another step. His bare feet shifted sand as the wall's edge dropped behind him. The temperature dipped sharply, desert chill sliding up his spine. He barely noticed. The horse lowered its head, not submissively, not in fear, just enough to acknowledge him. Its eyes, dark and impossibly deep, reflected no moonlight, and yet they shone. Asher stepped closer. 1 foot, then another. The distance between them closed like a door being pushed gently shut. The horse remained still, unmoving, silent, watching. He stopped just a few yards away, unsure what to do. He didn't know horse rules. He didn't know if this thing even was a horse. Then, something strange happened. The air between them thickened, not physically, but emotionally. Like someone had poured an old feeling into the space. A feeling you hadn't felt in years but immediately recognized. It was recognition, and grief, and comfort, all at once. The wind shifted. Asher's hair moved slightly. The horse blinked. Still, no shadow. Asher didn't reach out. He simply stood, eyes locked with the animal, breath steadying without his knowing. Inside the house, Jacob rose from the table. He walked past Eliza without speaking, grabbed his coat off the hook, and stepped out into the night. His boots crunched loudly on the gravel path as he walked around the house. He stopped cold when he saw them, boy and horse, framed by moonlight like a dream, a nightmare, a miracle. Jacob narrowed his eyes. "Eliza," he muttered, "come here." She joined him a moment later. Her gasp was soft but real. "That's not possible," she whispered. Jacob's voice was tight. "That horse has no shadow." Neither spoke for a long time. Jacob finally said, "It's him. The one from the ridge." Eliza nodded once. Years ago, just after the war, a local ranger swore he saw a horse without a shadow, wandering the edge of Dead Man's Dip. Everyone said he'd gone soft in the head. He hanged himself 3 weeks later. Dusk Creek didn't talk about him. Or the horse. Jacob clenched his jaw. "It's back." Eliza's hand found his arm. Or maybe it never left. Asher took one more step toward the horse. His foot landed silently in the dust. The world held its breath. The horse dipped its head again, and turned. Slowly, deliberately, it began to walk away toward the dip in the land, toward the shadows, toward whatever lay beyond that the town never dared name. It stopped once, just before the edge, looked back, waited. Asher looked over his shoulder. His grandparents stood frozen in the yard, fear and awe written in their eyes. Then he turned back, and took the first step after the horse. Not fast, not running, just walking. A boy with no words, following a horse with no shadow, into the desert, into memory, into something only the forgotten ever find. The wind picked up. The suitcase under the bed rattled softly in its hiding place, and the moon above Dusk Creek held itself high, casting silver over everything, except the two figures now disappearing into the dunes. The night followed Asher like breath he couldn't exhale. The moment the horse turned and slipped back into the desert shadows, Asher moved after it without thought, without sound, without even a glance back toward the house. The moonlight carved his path, a silver ribbon over dry earth, and yet every step he took felt like moving deeper into something unspoken, like peeling back a curtain in a room you were never meant to enter. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. The wind rose softly, like a sigh crawling through the bones of the land. Cactus thorns shimmered under moonlight, brittle and elegant like frozen lightning. Somewhere, an owl called once, sharp and distant. The horse shade, though Asher didn't know that name yet, moved with slow certainty, each step light but deliberate, like it remembered every stone it stepped over. Asher followed. His bare feet kissed the ground without hesitation, his small frame swallowed by the sheer scale of desert night. And then, the wind changed. It wasn't louder. It wasn't colder. It carried something. A voice. His mother's, soft, familiar, so gentle it made his knees weaken for a moment. "Don't be afraid, my love. You are not alone." Asher stopped cold. His chest tightened. His breath caught halfway to breaking. He turned in a slow circle, the sound hanging in the air like perfume fading. Never gone. No one was there. But it had been real. He felt it deep inside, like a chord struck in the hollow of his ribs. He turned back. The horse had paused several yards ahead, head tilted slightly, as if waiting. Asher wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, unsure when the tears had started. He didn't feel ashamed. He felt found. He followed again. They walked until the first pink inkling of dawn bruised the edge of the sky. When Asher finally returned to the house, his legs were trembling, his hands dust-caked and dry. He didn't try to sneak in. He didn't have to. Jacob was already waiting on the porch. The old man stood in shadow, arms folded, jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. "Inside," he said, without heat, without explanation. Asher climbed the steps, eyes lowered. Eliza watched from the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed and full of some emotion Asher couldn't name. Jacob didn't speak again that morning. But the next day, Asher found the barn doors chained shut, the back gate wired with barbed fencing, his boots taken from the porch, his pencil stub and drawing pad missing from their corner under the stairs. Silence wasn't punishment here, it was war. Late that afternoon, Eliza set out alone. Jacob hadn't seen the tracks, but she had. Early that morning, in the soft light before dawn, she noticed the prints outside the garden bed, hoofprints, unnaturally precise, not scattered or wild, like any horse she'd seen in her 72 years. She followed them beyond the fence line, down the old arroyo that once ran with rainwater decades ago. Dust Creek hadn't had real rainfall in years. The land cracked like old glass, but the tracks continued deliberate, unwavering. They led her to a place she hadn't stepped foot in since before her son enlisted. Back when Lucas used to bring her wildflowers and jokes, both just as reckless. The ground shifted, sand giving way to gravel, then hard-packed earth, baked to leather beneath the Nevada sun. Eliza reached the old firebreak, a place where trucks used to idle during fire season, where rangers would gather for late-night coffee and radio chatter. At the far edge stood the remnants of a forgotten building, swallowed partially by time. Its roof caved in, its walls bowed from years of wind assault. A military outpost once, then a ranger's station. Then nothing. No one had bothered to tear it down, just left it there like a scar. The hoofprints ended at the door. Eliza crouched down, ran her fingertips over the last print in the dust. It hadn't been there yesterday, she was sure of it. Something was calling, and it had chosen her grandson. Back home, Asher sat at the windowsill, knees drawn to his chest. The world beyond the glass moved without him. Flies danced in the sunlight. A windmill creaked like an old throat clearing. Somewhere behind him, Jacob hammered wood against wood, boarding up what remained of the barn. "You think I'm protecting you," Jacob had said that morning, not looking Asher in the eye. "But I'm protecting this town. From the kind of stories that kill men, the kind of stories that don't cast shadows." At dinner, no one spoke, not even Eliza, who returned with dirt under her nails and something unreadable in her eyes. Afterward, Jacob stood to his full height, voice low but loaded with finality. "That horse," he said, "ain't real. You understand me, boy? That thing don't belong here, and neither does whatever it's dragging out of you." Asher didn't look up. Jacob slammed his fist on the table. "You hear me? Still? Nothing." Then Eliza rose slowly, not angry, not afraid, just tired of the weight she'd carried for too long. "You keep building fences," she said, "and that child keeps finding a way through them. Maybe that's not the curse. Maybe that's the cure." Jacob stared at her. The silence between them had years of resentment sleeping inside it, but Eliza didn't flinch. She just left the room. That night, Asher didn't sleep. Not because he was afraid, but because something had begun to wake inside him, something raw, something ancient, something he had no words for. He reached beneath his bed and pulled out a blank sheet of paper, stolen from Eliza's kitchen drawer. He smoothed it carefully on the floor. Then, using the edge of a burned matchstick, he began to draw. He didn't draw the horse. He drew the voice. It came out as wind, lines that twisted and broke apart, shadows that had no shape, and in the middle of the page, a single eye, watching, waiting. Dust Creek was a place full of silences, but it was also full of rules, the kind that no one wrote down. Rule number 1, don't speak about what doesn't have explanation. Rule number 2, horses are fine, so long as they're wild and run away. Rule number 3, if something that should cast a shadow doesn't, it isn't real, or worse, it's wrong. Dust Creek didn't want stories. It wanted patterns. It wanted predictability. But Asher had already stepped out of the script, and the desert, restless, patient, was waiting for him to take another step. The moon rose again that night, rounder, brighter, more curious than before. Asher stood barefoot outside the window, the air cold on his skin. He felt no fear now, only ache. Ache for something he couldn't name. Ache for the voice that had whispered across the sand. Ache for the silent body of the horse whose very presence made the desert seem alive again. He stepped forward. His feet found the dirt road like they remembered it, out past the barn, past the chicken coop, long abandoned, past the line Jacob had drawn in barbed wire and warning looks. He walked, and above him the moon lit everything, except the place where the memory waited. The morning light in Dust Creek had a way of peeling secrets off the ground. It was the kind of light that didn't warm so much as expose, the kind that made people squint even when they weren't facing the sun. It poured through the thin curtains in Asher's small bedroom, touching the sketchbook in his lap like a hand asking for truth. He sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the old cedar wall, eyes locked on the page in front of him. The pencil in his hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something older, something deeper, like memory re-entering the bloodstream after being shut off too long. He drew in silence, not because he couldn't speak, but because language had always failed him. The paper listened. The horse came out in pieces, First, the curve of the neck, long and arched like a bow, ready to release. Then the mane, wild and wind-tangled, 1,000 strokes of resistance. The legs came last, rooted like pillars into earth, but poised for flight. But it was the eyes that took him the longest. Not because they were hard to draw, but because they weren't just eyes. They were windows, mirrors, graves. He didn't know how he knew, but every time he looked into those eyes, even in memory, he saw something flickering behind them. Smoke, heat, screaming wind, a flash of metal, a broken sound that could have been a name. He paused, pencil hovering over the page. Then he drew the shadow, or rather, he didn't. He left the space beneath the horse completely blank. The white void stood out on the page like an accusation. Something was missing. Something should have been there. And yet, somehow, the absence felt louder than any line he could have drawn. He stared at the drawing, breathing hard. His fingers were smudged with graphite. His cheeks, he realized, were damp. The knock came a few minutes later. 3 taps, polite but persistent. He didn't answer. He didn't move. The door creaked open anyway. "Hey," came a voice, soft and unsure. Asher looked up. A girl stood in the doorway, her dark hair pulled into a messy braid, her skin sun-warmed and dust-slick. She wore a green canvas jacket over scrubs and held a small paper bag in one hand. "I brought muffins," she said, as if that explained everything. It didn't trust. She stepped inside, slowly, like someone approaching a half-wild animal. "I'm Camila," she added, crouching to his level. "You don't have to say anything. I just figured breakfast tastes less lonely if someone else is around." Asher blinked. Camila didn't press. She just sat beside him, cross-legged, mirroring his posture. She placed the bag between them and pulled out 2 muffins wrapped in wax paper. Blueberry, by the smell. For a long minute, they sat like that. 2 people, one silent, one careful, both surrounded by unspoken things. Then Camila glanced at his sketchbook. "Is that the horse everyone says doesn't exist?" Asher stiffened. Camila smiled, not mocking, not curious, just tired, like someone who knew what it was to be dismissed. "I believe you," she said. Asher's head turned sharply. "I do," she continued. "I saw it. Once. A year ago, maybe. Out by the North Ridge. I told my supervisor at the clinic, and she said I was dehydrated. Dust hallucination, she called it." Camila paused. Her gaze drifted toward the window. "My dad used to tell me about the horse too. Said it had no shadow. Said it showed up when the desert wanted to speak." She turned back, her smile fading. Then he disappeared. Asher's eyes flickered. She didn't say anything else for a while. She just unwrapped her muffin and took a bite. The silence returned. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt shared. She noticed his drawing again. "That's a good likeness," she said. He stared at her, searching for a catch in her tone, a sliver of disbelief. There was none. Camila leaned back against the wall, wiping crumbs from her palms. "I think it's real," she said, softer now. "And I think it's tied to something old, something this town's been trying not to remember." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object metal, worn, shaped like a badge. "My dad's ranger tag," she explained. "He used to work out by the airstrip before they shut it down. 10 years ago, he went on a night shift and never came back. They found his truck 2 days later, abandoned on the fire road. Doors open, engine cold, no blood, no footprints." Her fingers ran over the name engraved on the badge. "No one investigated. No one even talked about it. They said the desert took him." Camila's eyes locked on his. "I think that horse knows something, and I think you're the one it chose to remember." Asher's hands trembled. He closed the sketchbook slowly and stood. Camila rose too, unsure. Then Asher moved toward the door, barefoot and urgent. He looked back at her once, no words, just a single, deliberate nod. "Come with me," she followed. They found Shade standing by the dead well behind the old stable, bathed in midday light like a monument. Camila stopped in her tracks. "Oh my God," she whispered. The horse was magnificent, up close, tall and lean, with a hide the color of storm clouds. It didn't flinch when they approached. It didn't move at all, except for the slow blink of its impossible eyes. And just as Asher remembered, there was no shadow. Camila stepped forward slowly, her breath hitching. "It's him," she murmured. "From my dream." Asher placed a hand on the horse's neck. Shade didn't react, just lowered its head slightly, acknowledging the contact. Then, without hesitation, Asher climbed onto its back. Camila's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "What are you?" But before the question finished, Shade moved. Not a gallop, not a trot. A smooth, gliding walk like the earth moved beneath him rather than the other way around. Camila stumbled after them, breathless, heart racing. The desert swallowed the trio in seconds. They rode for what felt like hours. The heat shimmered around them. Time stuttered. The world became fragmented, cracked sandstone, wind-hollowed canyons, lizards frozen in stillness. And then it began again. The visions. Asher clung to Shade's back, but the world around him blurred. He wasn't in the desert anymore. He was in the sky. Inside, a small plane. The window rattled beside him. A woman's voice, his mother's, called from the cockpit. "Asher, sweetie, tighten your belt." A jolt. The plane dipped. Screams. Metal screaming louder than humans. Flashes of red. A torn seatbelt. And then darkness. His fingers gripped Shade's mane tighter, but the horse kept walking, undeterred, calm. More images. Boots crunching gravel. A shadow moving through sagebrush. A voice shouting, "We're not supposed to be here." And then nothing. The memory broke like glass dropped too hard. Asher gasped as reality returned. Camila ran alongside them now, her face flushed and bewildered. "What's happening?" she cried. "Where are we going?" Shade turned toward a ridge, the sun at his back. His body shimmered under the light, like a mirage that didn't want to disappear yet. And as the three of them moved forward, deeper into the Badlands, something began to stir beneath the surface of Dust Creek. A secret, a silence, and the slow return of a forgotten name. The sun had started to tip westward, casting long shadows that dragged across the desert like tired memories. The heat shimmered off the rocks, but the air had grown still, too still, like the desert itself was holding its breath. Asher and Shade came to the top of the ridge without fanfare. No dramatic rise in wind, no sudden call of a bird, just silence, stillness, and then a feeling deep, old, and cold. Below them was a clearing. Not a clearing like one made by erosion or cattle or wind. This was circular, precise. The sand inside it had settled differently than the ground around it. The edges were sharper, like something heavy had landed or fallen years ago, then vanished into the desert's quiet hunger. Asher stared, breath shallow. There was something unnatural about the perfection of the shape, like nature had been interrupted here, denied its usual chaos. Shade didn't move. Then slowly, as if pulled by a weight he couldn't resist, Asher slid off the horse's back and stepped into the ring of disturbed sand. The moment his foot crossed the line, the world seemed to tilt. He staggered, not from exhaustion, but from a memory slamming into his chest like a forgotten heartbeat. A woman's scream, metal tearing. A boy's cry, his own. He dropped to his knees. Shade stepped forward behind him. Sand whispered under hoof. The horse paused at the edge of the circle, then bent its great head low and gently pressed its forehead to Asher's. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic, but it was the first time Asher felt something that wasn't loss. It was warmth. It was presence. His eyes widened, not from fear, but from recognition. He knew this feeling. He knew this touch. It was the way his mother used to press her lips to his temple before bed, whispering that the world was bigger than pain. It was the way his father's hand would find his shoulder before he climbed into the cockpit for another weekend flight. It was knowing someone was still out there, even if no one else believed it. Shade's eyes, impossibly deep, blinked slowly. Not like an animal, like a witness. Asher smiled. Just a little, just enough, and for the first time in nearly a year, a tear broke free and fell from his cheek, carving a clean line through the dirt on his face. He didn't cry like a boy. He cried like someone who remembered what hope felt like. Back in Dust Creek, Eliza stood at the sink, washing a plate that didn't need washing. Her fingers trembled. Her eyes kept drifting to the horizon through the dusty kitchen window. Jacob had gone into town hours ago, said something about needing fencing supplies, but he hadn't fooled her. He just didn't want to be in the house anymore. Not with all the silence thickening around it. Not with the way Asher had changed. He was still quiet, still careful, but something else had bloomed in him recently. Focus, fire, direction. And the drawings, they were getting more detailed, more exact, as if he were remembering things no child should have to carry, as if the horse wasn't just haunting him, but guiding him. She dried her hands on a towel and walked into the living room. On the table sat Asher's latest sketchbook, slightly open, its pages ruffled by a lazy fan overhead. She shouldn't have looked, she knew that, but she did. What she saw made her breath hitch. It wasn't just drawings of the horse now. It was landscapes, landmarks. One was the ridge behind their property, drawn with such precision she could recognize individual rock formations. Another was what looked like a crater, a perfect ring of disturbed sand, like something had dropped from the sky and never been spoken of again. Her hand trembled. She turned the page. The next image hit harder, a A small plane, single engine. She knew that shape, knew it too well. Lucas's plane, her sans, gone missing 2 years ago. Declared likely disintegrated on impact by the FAA. No debris, no survivors, no effort made after the first week. They said the desert swallowed what it wanted. But the dreams? She remembered the dreams Asher would wake from in a cold sweat. The same 3 words he had once whispered before falling silent again. He's not gone. She sat down heavily in the worn armchair, the badge her son had left behind resting on the table beside the sketchbook. She hadn't touched it in months. Now she picked it up, ran her thumb over the name, Lucas R. Bellamy, and whispered aloud, for the first time in a long time, "What if he's right?" Asher lay in the sand beside Shade, the horse's body warm and steady against the wind. Time moved strange in this place. He didn't know how long he'd been there, minutes, hours, but the sun was higher now, and the heat was creeping in. He traced the edge of the circle with his finger. Shade snorted softly, as if reacting to something unseen, and then it came again, the sound. That deep mechanical growl of an engine, faint, distorted, but there, a memory. The plane. He closed his eyes, and the scene unfolded once more. The interior of the cockpit, his mother's laugh, his father's hand on the throttle, turbulence, a warning beep, and then a bright white flash. Then darkness. But this time, something had changed. The memory didn't end. It continued. Flames. A torn seatbelt. His father crawling, bleeding, dragging himself from the wreckage and looking over his shoulder, calling a name. Asher. The voice shattered the stillness in his chest. He gasped. The vision vanished. Shade lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Asher sat up. His hands were trembling. But for the first time, it wasn't fear. It was direction. He looked around the ridge, scanning every rock, every tree, every scar in the sand. Something had happened here. He was sure of it. And someone had survived. That night, Eliza waited on the porch with a flashlight and a folded blanket. The sun was long gone, but she didn't pace, didn't call his name. She knew now Asher wasn't lost. He was searching. And somehow, the horse knew where he needed to go. Jacob returned just before midnight, saw the light on, the blanket still folded, his wife sitting with a look he hadn't seen in decades, 1 part fear, 2 parts belief. "What are you doing out here?" he grumbled. She looked up slowly. "I think the desert gave him a map," Jacob scoffed. "To what?" Eliza stood, stepped off the porch, and handed him the drawing of the crash site. The same drawing she had buried years ago, deep in her mind, because remembering it was too hard. He took it, reluctantly, studied it, and for one brief second, the silence between them broke. He whispered, "That's where they said the signal died." Eliza nodded. "Then, maybe that's where he's going." They both looked into the darkness, toward the ridge, toward the child who couldn't speak, toward the horse who never cast a shadow, and wondered if faith had finally found its way back to Dust Creek. The sun was higher than it should have been by the time they reached the outer rim of Dust Creek. The desert shimmered with heat, but the silence between Asher and Camila burned hotter. Neither spoke. Not because they didn't want to, but because they were both walking into a memory neither fully owned. Camila walked a few paces ahead, her boots crunching against loose gravel. Asher followed, his fingers brushing the worn edges of the leather-bound notebook she carried in her satchel. It had been her father's Kruth, and it held more truth than anyone in Dust Creek had dared speak aloud in 10 years. They reached a rusted fence half swallowed by sand. Beyond it, a slope of broken rocks twisted downward, hiding what remained of a trail once used by fire crews and military scouts. Shade waited by a mesquite tree nearby, calm as stone, tail flicking slowly like he'd known they'd end up here all along. "This way," Camila said, her voice barely a whisper. They ducked through the broken fence and followed the narrow path to an outcrop of shale and scorched brush. Nestled into the hill behind it, so well hidden it almost seemed accidental, was a single-room shack. The wood was warped, windows broken, the roof collapsed on one corner, a place the desert had nearly erased, but not quite. Camila stepped inside, ducking beneath a split beam. "This is where I found it," she said, her hand brushing the wall, fingers ghosting over burned paint and old initials. "CRM," she said, tracing the letters. "Carlos Rafael Mendez, my father." She knelt beside a pile of upturned crates and slid a weathered box from underneath. Inside were fragments, burned-out radio parts, military-grade wiring, pieces of what looked like a headset. And, buried at the bottom, the first thing she had ever dared to open, the notebook. She pulled it out now and handed it to Asher. He held it gently, as if it might fall apart in his hands. The leather was cracked, the corners stained with sweat and sand, but the writing inside was clear, sharp, intentional. Camila flipped to a marked page. June 23rd. Unmarked Cessna-type aircraft, flying low at 0300 hours. No lights, no ID code, no FAA records match flight path. She turned the page. June 4th. Same craft, different pattern. Circled Iron Hook Ridge twice. Signal disturbance on comms. Tried to record static. Shadows on the sand. No rotors. No explanation. And then, the 7th of June. Spoke to Lucas Bellamy. Confirmed my suspicions. He's seen it too. We need to file a joint report off book. Asher's hands tightened on the notebook. Lucas Bellamy. His father. Camila knelt beside him. My dad kept this hidden. From the Rangers, from the sheriff, from everyone. Because he knew if he turned it in, he'd disappear next. Her voice trembled. And he did. Asher turned the page again, and stopped. There was a hand-drawn map, faint lines, scrawled arrows, and a crude sketch of a cliff face split by a scar of black. It matched the place Asher had seen in his vision. He looked at Camila. Then, at Shade, still waiting outside the ruined doorway. He handed her the notebook, and turned to go. The canyon opened suddenly, a jagged gash carved into the earth, like the desert had taken a breath and never exhaled. Shade moved ahead slowly, each hoofstep deliberate, nostrils flaring with a subtle unease. The wind died here. Even the birds didn't come close. Asher stopped at the edge, heart hammering. Below them, half buried in rock and sand, lay the broken spine of an aircraft. White paint flaked under the sun. The tail was missing. One wing jutted upward at an impossible angle. The cockpit, crushed, was visible only through twisted metal and shattered glass. Camila gasped. Asher didn't move. He already knew. He had seen this wreck before. In dreams, in flashes, in Shade's eyes. They descended the slope in silence, their feet sliding over loose shale and powdery sand. When they reached the base, the heat turned stale, as if the air had been trapped since the crash. Camila moved cautiously toward the main cabin. There's no number, she said. No markings. It wasn't meant to be found. She peered into the wreckage, then stepped back, hand over her mouth. No bodies, she whispered. No bones, no blood. Shade walked slowly to the right side of the wreck, stopping beside a torn seat lodged against a boulder. The seatbelt strap fluttered in the breeze, dried but intact. Asher stepped closer. There was something under the seat, a patch of fabric, the edge of a torn flight jacket. He bent down and pulled gently. It came free easily, covered in dust, faded with time. He turned it over. Stitched into the collar, L. Bellamy. His chest tightened. He held the fabric against his chest for a moment, closing his eyes. Camila stepped back, hands trembling. We should call the sheriff. Asher opened his eyes, shook his head. We have to, she insisted. This is a crash site. It's evidence. He stepped forward, took the notebook from her hands, and without speaking, placed it gently on Shade's saddle. Shade didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood anchored, waiting. Camila stared at Asher, then at the saddle, then at him. You think someone survived? Asher nodded once, fiercely. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, Who? Asher pointed to the seat, then to his chest. His eyes burned with something ancient, something that refused to die. My dad, he mouthed. Camila exhaled sharply. The silence that followed was no longer disbelief. It was fear, not of Asher, not of the crash, but of truth, of what would have to come next. If Lucas Bellamy was alive, then Dust Creek had buried a secret much deeper than a downed plane. And now, they were the ones holding the shovel. The wind was thick that afternoon, laced with the kind of dust that burned the eyes and settled into the lungs like regret. Asher sat on the ledge just above the canyon's edge, fingers clenched into the rock beneath him, his heart racing from something he didn't fully understand, but felt down to the bone. Shade stood below, near the ruins of the plane, head low, body still. Asher hadn't moved since they found the flight jacket. He couldn't. Then, without warning, his vision bent sideways. Not dizziness, not heat stroke, something else, something deeper. His pupils dilated, his breath slowed, and the next memory came. Not his, not in words, but in pictures etched into bone, into Shade's memory, passed across some invisible thread woven between the living and the almost lost. The desert flickered like a burned reel of film, and then, in the middle of it, a man, crawling. He dragged himself through the sand, one arm clutching his ribs, his shirt soaked in blood. His face was sunburnt, half buried in grit. His lips cracked open, but no sound coming out. It was Lucas, not dead, wounded, barely alive, crawling away from the wreckage, trying to move faster than the storm overtaking him. His eyes locked onto something, maybe a shape, maybe a promise, and he mouthed a word Asher couldn't hear. Then the sand roared. The wind hit like fists. The dust swallowed everything, and Lucas vanished. Asher jolted backward, gasping, his hands clawing at the dirt. The vision ended, but the image of his father's face remained etched into his mind like fire on metal. He sat there, knees drawn in, trying to steady his breath. Shade lifted his head and climbed the incline toward him, his shadow still absent under the full sun, casting a chilling void behind him. Back at the house, the tension had begun to crack. Jacob had noticed the missing notebook, the tracks in the sand, the absence of Asher's shoes by the back door. He was already boiling when he stormed into the barn. "Goddamn horse," he muttered, fists clenched. "Goddamn secrets." He found the sketchbook tucked beneath the saddle blanket. He didn't even pause. He threw it to the ground and drove the heel of his boot into it again and again, ripping pages, breaking the spine, tearing the drawings into gray confetti. It wasn't just rage, it was fear, and history, and grief that had never been named. He didn't stop until the book was in shreds. Eliza watched from the porch, silent, arms folded. "You think that's gonna stop him?" she asked, voice low. Jacob turned, sweat on his brow, something wild in his eyes. He doesn't know what he's digging into. Eliza's stare was ice. "Maybe he does." He paced, breathing hard. "That horse, it's not right. It's not natural. That boy hasn't smiled in nearly a year," she snapped. "And he smiled with that horse." Jacob's hands curled into fists. "Then maybe that horse is the devil wearing a damn saddle." She stepped down, voice sharp. "Or maybe it's just the only one left who's telling him the truth." By sundown, Asher didn't return to the house. He took shelter instead behind the old grain silo, just past the tree line where the canyon met the wind-blown ridges. He lit a fire the way Camila taught him, with flint and patience. Shade lay nearby, eyes half closed, body between Asher and the wind. The fire cracked gently. Asher reached into his pocket and pulled out the one surviving page of the notebook, a torn corner that had been wedged into his sock when he climbed the hill. It held a single line from his father's handwriting, smudged but still legible. "If anything happens, trust Vernon." Asher looked up. He knew that name. Everyone in Dusk Creek did. Vernon Hale, Vietnam vet, hermit, lived 2 miles north in a cabin with boarded windows and a yard full of radios no one thought worked. The man hadn't been seen in public in years. The town called him crazy. Eliza called him dangerous. But Asher just saw the name circled. So, the next morning, he went. The hike was long, windy, uphill most of the way. Camila met him at the edge of town, wordless, a jug of water in her backpack, and a shotgun slung loosely over her shoulder, just in case. She didn't question where they were going, just walked. Shade followed behind them, limping slightly but determined. The trail ended at a small wooden cabin, mostly hidden by a thicket of coyote brush and bent juniper. No lights, no welcome. Asher walked straight to the door and knocked twice. Then again, then waited. A long silence followed. Then came the click of a lock. The door creaked open 2 inches. A single gray eye appeared in the crack. "You're Bellamy's boy," the voice rasped. Asher didn't blink. He nodded. The door opened. Inside, the cabin smelled of tobacco, oil, and something metallic. Maps covered the walls. Newspapers dating back 20 years stacked on shelves. Radios, screens, files. And in the center of it all stood Vernon, tall, gaunt, with a posture like twisted steel. He wore a faded army jacket and carried a cane fashioned from a rifle stock. "You saw the plane, didn't you?" he said, not as a question, but a confirmation. Asher nodded again. Camila stepped forward. "My father was on the list too." Vernon looked at her, eyes narrowing. "You Mendez's girl." She hesitated, then nodded. He turned and walked to the far wall. "You've found pieces," he said. "Fragments, but not the whole." He pulled out a box from beneath the floorboards. Inside, a folder marked Coyote Watch, eyes only. He opened it. Photos, satellite images, redacted documents, pages signed by Lucas Bellamy, and a small cassette tape. "Your father was flying a test route," Vernon explained. "But not for training. It was covert. He was carrying data on a program the service wasn't supposed to be running." "What kind of program?" Camila asked. Vernon looked at them both. "Experimental payloads. Chemical dispersal systems. Stuff outlawed in the 70s. They were using civilian planes, stashing evidence in no man's land, like Dust Creek." He tapped the folder. "They needed pilots, quiet ones, disposable ones. Lucas found out." He handed the cassette to Asher. "That's your dad's voice. He recorded this the night before the flight." Asher held it tightly, his hands shaking. "He's alive?" Vernon said, quiet now. "Or he was, long enough to pass a signal. But it got buried, and so did the story." He leaned closer. "They'll come for you, you know. When they find out what you've seen, when they learn that horse isn't just some ghost tale, that it's carrying memory." Camila whispered. "Why didn't you go public?" Vernon exhaled. Because the desert doesn't like the truth. He looked at Asher. But maybe it's ready now. And Asher, for the first time, didn't feel like a boy. He felt like a voice no one could silence. The sandstorm had no warning, just fury. It erupted over the horizon like a living thing cloaked in ochre, and howling like every secret the desert had ever buried was clawing its way back to the surface. The sky above Dust Creek turned the color of dried blood, and the sun vanished beneath a curtain of dust. Asher didn't care. He was already riding into it, bareback on shade, his arms wrapped around the horse's neck, fists clenched in its mane, rage boiling through his chest like wildfire in bone. He hadn't spoken, not since Vernon, not since the tape, not since the truth found him instead of the other way around. But his silence wasn't emptiness, it was purpose. Camila had tried to stop him, reached for him, pleaded with him, but Asher hadn't turned around. Couldn't, wouldn't, because something inside him knew. He didn't need to find a trail. He was the trail, and shade was the wind under it. The desert clawed at them, sand like razors, wind like fists, visibility reduced to a cruel joke. But shade pushed forward, relentless, hooves pounding dry earth as if chasing memory through the eye of a storm. Asher pressed his face against the stallion's neck, shielding himself from the gale, his heart pounding not with fear, but with expectation. Lucas was out here. He had to be. The wind screamed louder. The world blurred. The ground became meaningless. And then it hit. A gust so fierce, it felt like the desert itself wanted to rip them apart. Shade buckled. Asher's grip slipped. Everything spun. Then blackness. Time returned slowly, like a dying lantern flickering back to life. Asher opened his eyes, the world around him dim and strange. He lay on something soft, sand and pine needles. His body ached, every muscle sore, his lips cracked with thirst, his lungs raw from inhaling storm. The air was still and cold, not night cold, but cave cold. He sat up slowly. There were walls, stone walls, a natural formation, lit by a small fire in the corner. Flames danced across the rocks, casting shadows that twisted like ghosts. And then he saw him, a man, slumped against the far wall, half covered in blankets, gaunt, bearded, weathered like the mountains, dressed in patchwork survival gear, hands wrapped in cloth. He looked like he hadn't spoken to another soul in months, but he was breathing, alive, and his eyes were open, watching. They were the same eyes Asher saw in the mirror every morning. Asher didn't move, didn't blink. The man's brow furrowed. He tried to sit up, winced, then lowered himself again. "Hey," the man rasped, voice dry as gravel. "Don't come too close. I'm not sure this is real yet." Asher shook his head, blinking hard. Tears. Real ones. The man reached for a canteen beside him. Shaky hands. He took a sip, coughed, then looked again at the boy. "You're not, are you?" He stopped. Something in his mind twisting. "I used to have dreams about a boy," he murmured. Small, quiet, always drawing things. Asher stepped forward. Slowly, cautiously. The man's face twisted again, a memory clawing at the edge. "Blue eyes," he whispered, and a laugh like his mother's. The silence between them broke. And then, "Asher," the man said. A gasp, a plea, a question. The boy nodded. Lucas let the canteen fall. "Oh my God." Asher dropped to his knees beside him, hands trembling. Lucas reached out, but stopped short. I didn't think you were real." Asher didn't speak. He just placed his forehead to his father's chest and let the storm in his heart fall quiet. Outside the cave, the desert still howled, but not here. Not where the fire burned. Not where Shade stood motionless at the mouth of the cave like a statue carved from myth. His head turned into the wind, his hooves buried in sand. The storm whipped around him, but his body never moved. He cast no shadow, but he cast something else. Protection. Inside, Lucas leaned back against the wall, tears carving twin trails through the dust on his face. "I don't know how long I've been out here," he said. "Weeks, months, maybe more. I think I lost time." Asher handed him the tattered sleeve of his old flight jacket. Lucas stared. "I thought I'd died," he whispered. "After the crash, I woke up in the rocks, everything broken. My leg, my ribs, maybe my mind. I tried to signal, tried to move. Then the storm came. Everything went black." He looked at the boy again. "You found me." Asher nodded. Lucas smiled, eyes glassy. "And the horse?" Asher turned to Shade still at the cave's entrance, still unmoving. "He's not normal, is he?" Lucas asked. Asher didn't answer. He didn't have to, because they both knew. Later, after Lucas had eaten a few pieces of dried meat from his rations and drunk more water, he spoke again, quieter now. "I remember carrying something," he said. "Something important. Not just maps, not just comms. Logs." His fingers tapped his chest. A memory stick, hidden inside my tag. They told me it was a test flight, but it wasn't. I read the files. I saw what they were moving. He looked at Asher, eyes sharp despite the wear. It was military-grade nerve agents, undocumented, stored in firefighting containers. They were using us pilots to fly them over testing zones disguised as rescue drills. He took a breath. They used me. His voice cracked. And when I pushed back, they changed the flight plan, dropped my signal, and made sure I went down where no one would ever look. Asher reached into his satchel and pulled out the tape. Lucas stared. You still have it? Asher nodded. He placed it into Lucas's palm. Lucas clutched it like a heartbeat and wept. The fire burned low by midnight. Asher curled beside his father, head resting against his shoulder. Outside, the wind began to fade, and shade remained at the threshold unmoving, unbroken, watching the moon rise behind the sand. No shadow, just silence. And something else entirely. Faith. The cave breathed with a stillness that felt sacred. Somewhere outside, the wind had finally begun to retreat, its roar reduced to a whisper over the sand. Inside, the fire had burned down to a slow ember, glowing soft against the cave walls like the fading pulse of something ancient. Lucas and Asher sat side by side, neither speaking. There were no words for this. Not yet. Not after all that time. Not after all that silence. Lucas watched his son in the flickering firelight, his face taut with disbelief, eyes glassy with awe and grief, and something worse, guilt. Asher, knees tucked into his chest, rested his head against the stone wall, his gaze distant but unwavering. He wasn't afraid, not anymore, but he was waiting, giving space for something to settle, letting time catch up. Then Lucas noticed it, the chain around Asher's neck, silver, thin, worn smooth with age. Dangling from it was a small pendant, an amber-colored stone, oval, scuffed. It caught the light like a drop of honey and glowed faintly in the fire's reflection. Lucas reached out slowly, hesitantly, like he didn't believe his fingers deserved to touch it. Asher didn't stop him. Lucas's fingertips brushed the stone. His breath caught. Her necklace, he whispered, not speaking to anyone, not even himself, just remembering. She wore it every day. Asher turned his head slightly, eyes locking with his father's. The pendant sat between them like a bridge. Lucas cradled it in his palm, holding it as if it could burn him, or maybe resurrect her. His hand trembled. She gave it to me the morning we left, he said, barely audible. Said it would keep me safe. His voice cracked. I didn't give it back. Asher stared at him, unmoving. No blame. Just presence. Lucas let go of the necklace, his hand falling to his lap, his shoulders caving under years of weight. He looked at the boy again, studying him not just his face, but the silence behind it. That absence, that armor. And then the memory came. It struck like a thunderclap, sudden and vivid. The cockpit, the scream of the alarm, the clouds spinning. Lucas shouting, yanking on the yoke, trying to level the wings. The ground rushing up like a curse. Then her voice on the headset. Lucas, the signal's jammed. The rear cabin rattled. Asher's cry. Her reaching for him, strapping him into the back seat, her hands shaking but steady. You stay with him, Lucas shouted. Strap in, hard. Then the moment. The impossible one. The final seconds before impact. He looked at her, she looked at him. The unspoken passed between them. She nodded. He nodded. And then he unbuckled, lunged backward, wrapped his body around Asher's seat, shielding him with everything he had. Impact. The world fractured. Everything went white. Lucas blinked back into the cave. The fire snapped softly, its warmth now laced with memory. Asher hadn't moved. He reached for the stick beside him, a thin, broken branch from the kindling pile, then leaned forward and began to write in the sand. Each motion deliberate, each stroke slow. Lucas watched. The boy didn't look up, didn't explain, didn't pause until it was done. Then he placed the stick down gently and sat back. Lucas leaned forward. 4 letters. 2 words. Drawn into the cave floor with a hand that did not shake. I forgive. He stared at it, and then the dam broke. Lucas crumpled inward, both hands covering his face, his body folding over itself like something finally allowed to fall. Tears spilled freely, ragged, guttural sobs that came not from the throat, but from the marrow. The kind of crying that only comes from knowing you were never meant to survive and did anyway. And now you had to live with it. Asher sat beside him, unmoving, but his eyes were wet. He reached out and placed his small hand over his father's wrist. Just that, nothing more. Lucas grabbed it like it was the only solid thing left in the world. They stayed like that for a long time. No talking, no noise, just skin on skin, breath on rock, and 2 broken halves finding at last a seam to fit. Outside the cave, shade stood unmoving. The storm had passed, but the sky remained hazed and thick, like the desert had exhaled something it didn't quite want to release. The moon was rising now, cutting through the grit, pale and relentless. It shone over the desert floor, over the rock face, over the boy and the man, and the fire burning low. But when its light touched Shade, there was no shadow, not even now. Only that stillness, that impossible stillness. As if he wasn't just guarding the cave, but guarding something older, the moment before grief becomes healing. The silence before forgiveness becomes love. The breath before the past lets go. And in that sliver of night, something changed in the desert. Something let go, and something was returned. The desert was still when they emerged from the cave. No storm, no wind, only the soft whisper of dawn, stretching its fingers across the horizon like something remembering how to breathe. Asher walked beside his father, one hand gripping his jacket sleeve, the other tucked tight against his own chest. Lucas moved slowly, limping, breathing in short bursts, but alive. His presence no longer felt like a shadow. It was weight, substance, a name restored. Camila led them both, silent but alert. Her eyes never strayed far from the terrain. She didn't speak not because she didn't want to, but because she knew this part of the journey belonged to them. And behind them, always just a breath away, was Shade. Not tethered, not commanded, just following. Not like a horse, but like a memory made flesh. The wind no longer fought him. The earth no longer resisted. The long walk back to Dusk Creek wasn't marked by words, only small glances, Lucas rubbing the sweat from his son's neck, Asher pausing at every dry bush, every worn rock, as if the land itself had changed in his absence. And maybe it had. As the edge of town appeared in the golden haze of morning, a hush fell between them. The roofs of Dusk Creek shimmered under first light, smoke curled from chimneys, wind chimes tinkled lazily, and the town remained exactly as it always had been, unchanged, indifferent. But for them, everything was different. Lucas slowed. Asher looked up at him. Camila stopped. And Shade froze, just 20 yards from the first fence post marking the town's boundary. He stood there, his hooves digging gently into the sand, his breath steady, his eyes fixed not on Dusk Creek, but on the horizon behind them. Something in his stance said no further. Asher turned, confused. He stepped toward Shade, reaching out a hand to coax him forward. But Shade didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even shift his weight, just stood in the liminal space between wild and known, past and present, dream and memory. Lucas placed a hand on Asher's shoulder. "Let him be," he whispered. Asher hesitated, but nodded. He stepped back slowly, lowering his hand. Camila watched, eyes glinting. Lucas turned to her. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a bundle, wrapped in cloth. Carefully, reverently, he unwrapped it. Inside, a silver badge, old, scarred, and a folded notebook. Worn leather, frayed corners, the initials CRM, still visible beneath the dust. Camila's breath caught. "My dad," she whispered. Lucas nodded. "He was the one who warned me, who tried to stop the flight. He was working surveillance for the ranger station. We shared intel. I trusted him more than command." He handed her the badge. "He died for the truth." Camila's hands shook as she took it. "No," Lucas added. "He lived for it." A long silence passed. Then Lucas stepped back and let the moment settle between them. Camila pressed the badge to her chest, eyes brimming, mouth a tight line of unspoken gratitude and grief. Then the wind shifted, and they all turned. Shade had begun to move, not forward, but sideways parallel to the boundary fence, following the line where dawn spilled light across the desert floor. He walked with measured steps, hooves nearly silent. The sun hit him in pieces, illuminating parts of his mane, the curve of his flank, the edge of his ear. But no shadow followed. None. He walked like he wasn't entirely there. Like light passed through something only memory could see. And then he stopped, turned his head, looked straight at Asher. The boy took a step forward, eyes wide, throat tight. Shade tilted his head slightly. Asher raised his hand, fingers splayed, palm outward. And Shade closed his eyes. A soft gust of wind swept across the sand. When Asher blinked, Shade was gone. No collapse, no sound, no vanishing spark. Just gone. Only the silence remained. And in the sand where Shade had stood, a single hoofprint. Clear, perfect, and like everything else about him, cast no shadow. Asher fell to his knees beside it, fingers trembling. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just touched the mark. Lucas stood behind him, one hand over his heart, eyes shimmering. Camila crouched beside the boy. They watched as the sun rose higher, spilling gold across the desert, pushing shadows into corners, lighting the rooftops of Dusk Creek. And still, that single hoofprint remained untouched, like a promise, like a truth no one could erase. Later that morning, when the townspeople stirred and word began to spread that Lucas Bellamy had returned, broken, changed, but breathing there were no cheers, no parades, just silence and stares. Dust Creek was not a town built for miracles, but it had just witnessed one, and it would not forget, even if it tried. Asher, now walking tall beside his father, returned home not as the mute boy shaped by grief, but as the boy who remembered everything at his fete, and who chose to forgive. The boy who followed a horse made of memory through the darkness, and came back with the light. It didn't begin with a headline. It began with a whisper, a rumor, a name resurfaced. A town no one had marked on a map since the interstate bypassed it 20 years ago. But now Dust Creek was on fire, not with heat, with truth. The footage first leaked through a freelance blogger from Carson City, an anonymous source handing over pages of redacted military logs, names, dates, coordinates. One file, Operation Coyote Watch, bore the Department of Defense's watermark. The ink smudged but unmistakable. Within hours, it hit national networks. Undisclosed chemical test flights linked to disappeared pilots. Former military pilot resurfaces after presumed death brings evidence. Dust Creek, the town that tried to bury the sky. Then came the cameras, the vans, the spotlights that didn't belong in a town of 142 people. Lucas Bellamy sat at the town hall, eyes heavy, voice low, and read from his notebook. There were no theatrics, just facts. Quiet, damning facts. Names of supervisors, flight manifests, warnings that were ignored, friends who were silenced. He didn't accuse, he just remembered. Asher sat beside him, silent as always, but his hand never left the necklace around his neck, and somehow that said more than any microphone could capture. By the end of the week, the Department of Defense released a carefully worded statement: historical oversight, inappropriate data suppression, rogue field operation. The words apology and cover-up were never used, but everyone knew they had been caught. The files were real. The missions had happened. The men, Camila's father, Lucas, and others, had been right all along. The storm that had started with one horse and one silent boy now rumbled through congressional hearings and late-night interviews. The truth no longer lived in caves or inside the bones of ghosts. It had shape now. It had sound. Back in Dust Creek, something else began. Something softer. Something louder in the long run. On the edge of town, just past the fence line where shade once stood, Eliza opened the gate to a parcel of land she and Jacob had left fallow for decades. Once a ranch, then a graveyard of old machinery. Now, it became sanctuary. She called it the Sanctuary of Shade, a place not defined by structures, but by space. Open space, quiet space. It didn't advertise, didn't charge, didn't ask for backstories. It simply opened, and they came. The first horse arrived 3 days after the press vans left town. A gray mare, scarred across the haunches, eyes like fog. Then a paint gelding, barely able to stand from neglect. Word spread among the outer counties Eliza was taking in the unwanted, the abandoned, the broken. Not to ride, not to tame, just to let be. By week's end, 9 horses grazed the land free, unburdened, unnamed, and children followed. Camila walked the perimeter of the sanctuary that first morning, boots coated in red dust, hair tied back, the badge of her father still inside her pocket. The school counselor had called. 6 students, 2 of them foster kids. One nonverbal wanted to walk with the horses. No therapy, no questions, just walk. Camila nodded. She didn't need credentials to understand healing, just memory, and the weight of silence. She created a method no one had taught her. She called it the quiet walk. 1 child, 1 horse, 30 minutes. No talking, no commands, just breath, step, ground. Every day, more came. Children with trauma, children with rage, children who hadn't been touched by kindness in months. They didn't need her to fix anything. They just needed the chance to be next to something that didn't ask for explanations. One afternoon, a boy named Elijah, 7 years old, diagnosed with selective mutism, placed his hand on the flank of a dun gelding and simply breathed for 10 minutes. When he came back, he hugged Camila. Didn't say a word, but the hug held a whole language. Asher returned often, not every day. Sometimes with Lucas, sometimes alone. He didn't walk the perimeter like the others. He didn't follow the horses. He simply sat on the same hill where shade had once stood, watching, waiting, listening to the way the grass moved, the way hooves sounded when they didn't carry fear. He drew pages filled with images, none of them shaded, all of them light. He gave them to the children who didn't yet know how to speak, and somehow they understood. Lucas stayed in town. He bought back the old gas station and turned it into a repair shop. He worked with his hands, fixed engines, refused tips, laughed more. At night, he wrote letters to the families of the other pilots. Sometimes they wrote back. Sometimes they didn't take, but the act mattered. Truth, after all, wasn't only owed, it was earned, piece by piece. Dust Creek changed. Not overnight, but in increments. In the way people greeted each other at the post office. In the way they left apples by the sanctuary gate. In the way the mayor stepped down without ceremony. In the way the sheriff donated a chunk of his pension to the sanctuary. No one said the word forgiveness out loud, but it echoed in every hoofprint, in every quiet walk, in every meal dropped off on Camila's porch without a note. One morning, a storm threatened the northern ridge. Not a violent one, just rain. Asher stood beneath the eaves of the sanctuary barn, watching the clouds roll in. Beside him, Eliza folded her hands. "You still look for him, don't you?" she asked. He didn't nod. He didn't deny it. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to." He turned to her. She smiled. "He's here," she said. "In this." And then the rain came. Soft, steady, washing everything but the memory. 3 years passed. Dust Creek didn't grow. It deepened. Seasons came and went like breaths. Wind-sharp winters, silver-slick springs, and the kind of summers where the heat didn't rise. It waited patient and pulsing just beneath your skin. But some things bloomed. At the edge of the sanctuary of shade, where the fence met the wild salt brush, a circle of sandstone had formed, weathered by hooves, shaped by wind. The children called it the listening ring. It wasn't built. It happened. And every morning, Asher came. 12 now, taller, shoulders straighter, cheeks leaner. The wide blue of his eyes no longer drowning but reflecting, still silent. Not a word, not a single sound ever left his mouth. But everything spoke through him. He didn't teach with chalk or books. He taught with sand. He'd kneel inside the listening ring as the kids formed a loose circle around him, some fostered, some withdrawn, some carrying secrets heavier than any adult could name. And Asher would take a stick and draw, not pictures, symbols, a spiral, a line broken in the center, a hoofprint with a teardrop inside it. Then he'd hand the stick to one of them, invite them to draw back, and slowly, over weeks, they built a language. One boy drew waves to mean fear. A girl drew suns to mean, I see you. No one spoke, but everyone heard. Then came the horses. Asher never forced them to engage. He never bridled, never led. He just invited, one at a time. The children stood in the ring and turned their backs to the horses grazing nearby, and waited. Some days, nothing happened. But sometimes when the silence got deep enough, one of the horses would approach. No sound, no cue, just presence, and gently press its nose to the child's back. That was the lesson. Asher called it hearing with your spine, not out loud, but with his hands, with his breath, with the sand. Lucas worked the stables now, still limping, still learning how to hold a hammer again. But every morning he showed up. His hands no longer shook, his eyes no longer darted, and though some nights he still woke sweating and silent, he no longer apologized for being alive. He'd nod to Asher across the paddocks. Sometimes Asher nodded back. Sometimes he didn't. It didn't matter. Love didn't always return to sender the same way. On an early autumn evening, just as the wind shifted and the last of the day's light was curling beneath the barn eaves, a new girl arrived. 8 years old, hair tangled, eyes red-rimmed from days of not sleeping. She held a shoebox with both arms, like it was her heartbeat. Inside, a photo, a lock of hair, a plastic bracelet. Her mother had died 3 weeks earlier in a house fire. The girl hadn't spoken since. Camila walked beside her, slow and steady. Didn't offer therapy, didn't offer hope, just a place to be. The girl followed her through the gates. The other children watched from the distance, all quiet. She didn't meet their gaze, didn't cry, just walked, and then stopped. At the edge of the listening ring, Asher stood on the other side. He didn't smile, didn't approach. He simply knelt and drew a line in the sand, just one. Then he stepped back and sat, hands on his knees. The girl didn't move, not at first. Then she walked into the circle. Kneeling slowly, she reached for the stick he'd left. She drew something, a flame, and next to it, an open hand. Then she dropped the stick. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't cry. Asher nodded. He stood, walked out of the ring, and disappeared into the barn. The girl sat alone, watching the lines in the sand. The others waited. Wind stirred. And then from behind her, hoofbeats, soft, measured. The girl turned her head. Standing just beyond the fence line, where the last of the evening sun bled into the dust, was a horse. Not just any horse. Gray, unbridled, unclaimed. Eyes pale as ash. No shadow. None. The air changed. Children fell silent. Even the wind paused. The horse stepped forward. The girl didn't move. He came slowly, reverently, his hooves making barely a sound, until he stood in front of her. She looked up. He lowered his head. She raised her hand. Fingers touched velvet muzzle. No fear. No flinch. Just contact. Then, a breath. From both of them. As if grief had found its twin, the girl closed her eyes, and in the softest whisper of movement, the sand beneath them curled upward in a quiet swirl like the earth blessing the moment. That night, as stars gathered thick above the desert and the children lay scattered across hay bales, hammocks, and cots, Camila lit the lanterns at the sanctuary's gate. Lucas helped her nail the final wooden plank across the arch above the entrance. Asher stood watching. When they stepped back, Camila handed him a piece of chalk. He didn't hesitate. He climbed the step, reached up, and wrote in the silence, each letter slow and carved with reverence. Faith needs no voice, only heart. They didn't clap. They didn't speak. They just stood there together, watching the words dry in the desert wind. And somewhere in the dark, hooves whispered across sand. But no shadow followed.